it's kind of like trying to thin a needle, and unfortunately, everyone's going to be a little bit different. And sometimes, if you're just thrown together, that one of the people may not want to co-teach together. It just kind of creates a recipe for disaster. So, what we found in Belinda's consulting with many school districts around the United States and across the world, as well as my experience, is really giving teachers the opportunity to go through kind of like a speed dating process.
What if you turn hardship into greatness, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Dr. Rhoads. Dr. Rhoads is the author of Co-Teaching Evolved together with Dr. Belinda Carr. Have you ever wondered what co-teaching is? Why and how co-teaching can improve your teaching and, most importantly, your students' learning? If so, join us now in this beautiful conversation. Welcome, Dr. Rhoads, to the show. It's such a pleasure. Welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me on your podcast. I'm super excited to be here and to talk about co-teaching.
Yeah, it's so interesting. But before we really dive into it, we want to know a little bit more about who Dr. Rhoads is. And now just start, and that's a kind of a challenge. Who is Dr. Rhoads in only one powerful sentence?
I would say that I'm an instructional and edtech leader that supports K through 12 adult education and higher education institutions and all things like instructional instruction and through educational technology.
What brought you into education in the first place?
Well, initially I was never in education. I went to law school and dropped out, and ultimately I think through that process I found that I love helping people, and I love tutoring, and I love teaching in general throughout my college years. And I think that's what brought me into education. Just really enjoyed helping people, teaching and learning myself, and I find it really fun. So that's kind of, I think, the reason why I got into this.
Now, what is co-teaching in the first place?
Yeah, so co-teaching can take many different forms. So traditionally, if we look at the North American, um, angle of it, it's where there's a general education teacher as well as a special education teacher, and really the goal in those classrooms is to create inclusive and equitable environments for students. Whether they have a disability or a multilingual learner. That's what we traditionally see with those two credentialed teachers in the classroom. But it can take many different forms as well. It can be a career technical education teacher and an English language specialty teacher. It can be a general education teacher as well as at times an instructional aide. It can be two different college professors that have different expertise that are co-teaching a class together. There's so many different variations. Even I think you could even say when a parent volunteer comes in that's regularly, and the teacher actually plans with them. So I think that there's a lot of unique ways that this works. And I really think it comes down to is being able to have it regularly happen. And secondly, the two teachers are planning together to create, um, you know, that environment where students are getting two adults in the classroom, supporting them in their learning.
What made you interested specifically in co-teaching? You just elaborated you first went to a law school, ultimately find kind of the joy of learning, and then really started your journey in education. So how did you come across co-teaching?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny when I first started teaching as a special education teacher. The school that I was at just threw me into co-teaching, and I co-taught for many years. So that was just kind of how I got into it. And I was in experiences where I knew that what was working versus what was not working as well, from the teacher level to the school and district level. So um, that's where I got a lot of the motivation to write this book, along with Dr. Karj. And Dr. Karj is someone that's been in special education for over 30 years, and she's had a lot of experience working with co teachers from across the country. And her and I met in my doctoral program, and she was one of my mentors. And we both started talking about co-teaching, instruction, educational technology, and AI. And we're like, well, things are really changing. And Matt brings some of these more recent experiences, and then Dr. Karch has been working in this for 30 years and has a ton of research behind all the co-teaching strategies that we talk about in the book. And really, we felt that it would be a great partnership for us to work together on this to really create I think, a really modern point of view of how co-teaching can work and how we can really optimize it to support co-teachers in a wide variety of different contexts, as I mentioned earlier.
Now, let's dive into the book. I really enjoyed the book because it really gives you a roadmap, a really powerful roadmap, actually, how you can proceed. And it's not easy because one thing is always is that there is a beautiful proverb that says, you can go alone fast, but together you can actually go far. And so it just illustrates a little bit also the complexity with working another individual, right? So how do you actually decipher and actually then being able to choose a co-teaching partner, and what are the kind of challenges that you usually or that you faced
Yeah, so
in
I mean,
your early
yeah, it
days?
all begins with how the school and district wants to set it up. I've seen it where you get partnered up at random, or there's opportunities to really meet the co-teach possible co-teachers the year before you co-teach together, through kind of like a speed dating co-teaching type experience. I've seen it where teachers that have been in the same department, have been working together for many years, decide to go co-teach together. Um, but there's a wide variety of different ways to do it. And the reason one of the ways that I think that you should not do is just pair someone together at random to co-teach. It's one of the worst things that you can do, because um, it's kind of like trying to thin a needle, and unfortunately, everyone's going to be a little bit different. And sometimes, if you're just thrown together, that one of the people may not want to co-teach together. It just kind of creates a recipe for disaster. So what we found in Belinda's consulting with many school districts around the United States and across the world, as well as my experience, is really giving teachers the opportunity to go through kind of like a speed dating process at the end of the year, before they even get paired together as co-teachers, really to see if their personalities mesh, their teaching philosophies mesh, the way that they navigate various situations. So it's important for schools and districts to kind of create a scaffolded approach to those opportunities where those co-teachers can meet and greet and talk about education, and really kind of see where their personalities meet as well as their teaching philosophies meet. And then hopefully naturally they pair together. Or, it seems like based on like interest surveys and their conversation, that they are going to be the better pair, versus some of the others that they discussed earlier in those experiences. So um, we feel like that is one of the better ways to do it. Give them the opportunity to get to know each other before they become a pair, and then really kind of set up a kind of once they're paired at that point to have them come up with essential agreements, have them come together on who's doing what, um, and it's definitely you have to think about it as a longitudinal process. It's not something that you can just throw together. We really talk a lot about that in this book, and it's really critical to building a strong partnership with someone by really getting to know them, coming together, kind of creating a contract together, which is we call it the central agreements, and then just taking that forward to creating the routines as well as um, the mechanisms in the class that will help it move forward. So that's really really critical for co-teaching.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned speed dating. I think that's something, it has something, because sometimes at first glance you can really feel if you match with someone or not. It's almost like, love at first sight. Sometimes it really works. I think it can reveal a lot. But of course, it's always better if you can truly engage ultimately with one another, and you have to plan. And therefore, really, it comes true that it takes a lot of time, just coordinate, cooperate with one another. So it's laborious, definitely. Down the road, you really talk so nicely and impactfully about also the stages. But I just want to touch first about the collaborative aspect, and also how it changes, if at all, the classroom management component, but also its environment.
Yeah, so there's a lot that comes down to, like I mentioned, with the essential agreements, but then in terms of really that long-term planning piece as well as the short-term planning piece, but also having knowledge of um, what co-teaching looks like and what are the various essentially strategies that are involved as well as the stages. Starting off at the lower levels, going up to the mid-tier co-teaching strategies, and then to more of the advanced, and really understanding where those strategies go in terms of your planning, as well as um, you know how are you going to integrate it with your content, and then also really knowing your students needs. But what I really like about co-teaching and the strategies is they're dynamic. You can move between them pretty instantaneously throughout class. So I'll give you an example. You can start the class together, both co-teachers up in the front, and we call that team teaching. So team teaching is where maybe you're introducing things to the class, one teacher's modeling something, one teacher's explaining something, and then you could go moving into a quick writer formative assessment where one teacher is up front still kind of explaining the directions, while another one is roving around the classroom ensuring the students are ready and engaged on that formative assessment. And then after that formative assessment's over, maybe a certain number of students didn't do too well on it, and the class is then split into various groups, and you can go into what we call parallel teaching, where one teacher in the front is maybe moving forward with the newer content, while another teacher in the back is working on reinforcing that content, the older content, so that the students that maybe didn't score that well on that assessment are going to get that reteaching again. And then after a certain given amount of time, they come back together to team teach and transition to the next activity. So we can see how it could be very dynamic. But in terms of your planning pieces, I think that when you're starting off as co-teachers is that you have like 3 or 4 co-teaching strategies that you're always going to do at certain times of your lessons. And once you have that in place, that's a great foundation where you can move back and forth between those 3 or 4 co-teaching strategies. And then as you get more experience co-teaching, you can add more and more strategies to that toolkit to where then you can move between more of those strategies in terms of your lessons and your planning.
Do you think it increases also the engagement in class from students?
Yeah, I think that when you have just 2 adults in the classroom and they're, strategically working with students, there's gonna be a higher degree of engagement because, uh, 2 people can cover way more than just one.
But also, you really explain this process, and it really comes through that you're an expert on what you're doing. And yet, I have to say that to really get to this level requires an incredible amount of work and really experience. So, what is usually the time that someone has to invest in order to get to a top level of co teaching?
I would say it takes a number of years. And what I also would recommend is that co teaching pairs stay together for a number of years. You're not going to get the best fruits of that co teaching partnership and probably until year 2 or 3, just based on just the experience of working with someone, um, as well as just building your own capacity of co teaching with that person. Because every partnership, there's a different dynamic and there's a different synergy, um, as well as maybe you haven't taught that particular content or with that grade level before, with that particular co-teaching or co-teaching in general. So there's a lot of those variables that you have to take into play. And I would say, if you're in your first year co-teaching with someone, you really try to, keep it, like I mentioned, those 3 to 4 strategies, and then as you move into year 2 and 3, you expand, but you're more familiar with the content, especially if you're teaching the same grade level or content area again. And ultimately, it's going to be you're going to perform better because you've had all that experience. But I also think that what schools can do, if you have co teachers teaching other classes, is providing opportunities for those co-teachers to go in and watch other co-teachers, whether watching them live or having those lessons recorded, and also having an instructional coach watching and providing feedback to co-teachers, as well as giving them opportunities to rehearse some of the co-teaching strategies before they're actually in a classroom doing it with students, because there's a degree of sophistication with them, and as well as there's a timing piece. And I think that's where, when I talk about that synergy piece, is that you make that eye contact with that person while you're doing that particular strategy, and each of you know exactly where someone needs to be at that time, as well as yourself. So um, there's a lot that goes into it, but just circling back to where I started, is that I think by it's going to take a couple years at least to get to that, more of that optimal level, especially if you're with that same person.
Yeah, and it really makes sense. Usually it takes you about 5 years really to really get comfortable in teaching, right? And that you really can start enjoying the ride, right? While actually driving it, at the same time. And so 3 years really sounds like a very, realistic time frame. What was your biggest challenge when you personally started co teaching back in the days?
Yeah, so the hardest challenge was, being with multiple co-teaching partners. So that first year co-teaching, I was with 3 teachers. I taught 5 periods, and I taught 2 periods with a teacher, and then 1 period with one teacher, and then another with another. So I had 3 co-teachers that year. So it's really hard logistically to plan and provide really good co-teaching when you have so many different partners in a year, and that makes it, you know, what are you going to prioritize, and especially a lot of special education teachers, they have a large caseload of students that they're also monitoring at the secondary level. So it makes the job very, very difficult. So I always recommend that focus on just having one co-teaching partner. And if it's 3 to 4 periods, or if you're in elementary school, it's half the day, I think it's really worth the investment versus really kind of placing co-teachers together only for like 1 hour a day.
Yeah, it really makes sense. So lay out some of your co-teaching strategies that you highly recommend. As you mentioned, you usually say, let's start with maximum 4 strategies, right? And I think it's really important also, this really research also actually shows that if you have more than 3 to 4 choices, you just get overwhelmed, right? You have to narrow it down. And that's also why teachers and co teachers are so important, because they help the student to actually narrow things down so they are somehow relieved of the burden of making a choice. Because today, I think we have the problem is that we have the illusion of having too many choices.
Yeah, and
Really, with anything, right?
I would say for myself, I always like team teaching. Team teaching really sets the tone, and it makes it so that the students know that there's two adults in the classroom that are leading the class together from start to finish. I would say that's one of my favorites. Always when I'm starting a lesson with a co-teacher, I would say I like parallel teaching quite a bit as well. Because after the team teaching piece, maybe we're co-modeling something together, doing a couple worked examples. Then I can take one part of the class, the other co-teacher can take the other part of the class, and we can slightly differentiate the instruction and work on areas that different groups of students may need more work with, or we can further extend with a group. So that's why I really like parallel teaching. I also like station teaching, where maybe you're working in three or four different small groups, and each of the individual groups are working on a different skill. You can have one of the co-teachers leading one of the small groups where they're getting that additional reteaching or that additional intervention for their instruction, while the other co-teacher is monitoring all the other stations and ensuring the students are completing the tasks and practice that they need to do. um, that station teaching. And I also like role playing when I'm co-teaching. So there's a role playing strategy when you're co-teaching, especially I have a background in English language arts and social science. So especially if you're doing a novel and role playing within that context of a novel when you're reading it to students, as well as enacting parts of the novel itself, I think that role playing piece is huge. Um, Also, thinking about role playing in terms of classroom routines, role playing all those routines with your co-teacher is really powerful as well. So I would say that those kind of four are kind of my go-tos. But as I mentioned earlier, you're going to go between some others as well, like one teach, one support, teach and observe, alternative teaching. So I mean, it really ebbs and flows, but I would say that, for me at least, in my experience, those have been some of the most successful ones.
What is that really gives you the biggest joy in co-teaching?
That you're doing it together, because sometimes teaching can be very isolating in terms of, teaching by yourself. And you have someone to bounce ideas off of and talk to and go through the highs and lows of teaching. I think that co-teaching provides that to, um, you know, teams of teachers. And I think that um, you're also in that position as a learner. You're learning from your other co-teacher in the class, and they're also learning from you. And so I think it's sometimes even some of the best professional learning that you're going to get from those experiences. So I think there's a lot of those benefits that you get when you're working with someone.
I also really appreciate what you mentioned in the book, that the student always remains at the very heart and center of learning. How do you ensure that the students will always remain at the very heart and center of learning?
I mean, I think when it comes to having two co-teachers in the class, is that you really get to know your students, and you get to see kind of how the other co-teacher that you're working with in the class interacts with students in those relationships. There's different relationships between different students and teachers, and I really think that when there's just more adults in the classroom, it's going to be more student centered because they're getting more attention from the adult in the classroom, right? They're getting more of that instruction. They're getting more of being able to build a positive relationship with an adult. They're getting more attention for getting more feedback on their work. They're able to communicate more with family. So I think that there's just more benefits by having just two adults in the classroom supporting students. They're going to get much more than if it was just for one adult in the classroom.
Supposing that there is this really fruitful engagement and relationship between the two co-teachers, right? What can be the downsides if this is not the case?
Yeah, so I mean, there can be situations where one teacher takes over, too much of the instruction or micromanages the other. Um, that can definitely happen more often than not. There's not a degree of parity. When we see co-teaching where there's not a degree of parity, it can cause resentment and it can cause jealousy. Um, it can also cause for students not getting the best of both teachers because of all those things that I discussed that are happening. So it really requires the teachers to be able to communicate. I don't like the marriage analogy very much. A lot of people talk a lot about that in co-teaching. It's because it's not necessarily a marriage because it's not a lifelong situation, but it's definitely a it's a bond that you have with that co-teacher that you're working with them, more than you're seeing your family if it's an all day type of thing. So it really comes down to being able to really communicate, be vulnerable, um, and not just asking them what you want and really going back to the basics at times, especially after a hard day. If you have a lot of classroom management issues or there's just a lot going on, um, sometimes it's okay with going back to those essential agreements that you started off with at the beginning and revising those. So because those needs are changing, but it's always just it's so essential to be able to communicate. If you're not someone that's able to be open and vulnerable and co-teaching, it's going to be something that's going to be harder for you to pick up. Also, I think for individuals that like micromanaging and always getting what you want, it also makes it very difficult as well. So um, it's an ebb and flow, and um, you're not always going to be at that equilibrium piece, but the goal is for co-teachers is to have a degree of parity. It's not always going to be equal, but there's going to be that parity in play where they have their own expertise, they have their strengths, but there's a synergy that comes together between them.
Why do you think co-teaching, also in the sense of getting more and more popular, actually? But of course, there is also a challenge in terms of resources, right? So where do you think does this more and more popular way of actually teaching comes from?
I mean, I think that when policymakers, school leaders, district leaders um, go into co-teaching classrooms where they have two experienced co-teachers and they see the benefits and how that's impacting all students, whether it's a co-taught traditionally class where there's students that have special needs or the co-taught class where there's a lot of multilingual learners, or even in situations where it could be a what we call in my region in the United States gate student, but also there's an exceptional learning co-teacher and a general ed co-teacher, or for example in the college environment. I mean, I think it just shows when you see something done really well and students, the data is proving that this is successful, that your investment is successful. Co-teaching is a very can be expensive, but at the same time, though, there's a lot of data related to um, in those situations that students their outcomes are better. And I think that when we're looking at that, if their outcomes are better, and we know that this is working, then it's something that we should invest in.
There was also a discussion, actually mentioned this in the book, that in the US, usually teachers pay teachers, but in other countries, they really work more closely together, and they do so by actually applying the research from the United States of America. So that's actually very interesting. So elaborate on that
Yeah, I
further.
mean, I think that if you go to a lot of other countries, especially Western countries in Europe, they spend more time collaborating, more of the day instead of just 1 hour a week, usually, or maybe a couple hours here and there. They're spending half the day planning and collaborating together and learning from each other and applying the research. So that's something that when that's there's a lot of research behind that in terms of student outcomes. When there's more planning taking place and collaboration between teachers, there's going to be better student outcomes. And one thing I think what um, pragmatic school and district leaders can do, especially when you're co-teaching, is giving those co-teachers that plenty of that planning time so that they can really collaborate and design some of the better lessons and learning experience for students. So I think that principle applies. But I do envy a lot of international schools in countries around the world that give teachers more planning time, because I think their instruction is going to be ultimately better when they're planning and collaborating with their colleagues versus teaching 8 hours a day.
What do you think about what Rousseau actually said? And he said that in Emil, he wrote that a certain form of scarcity is actually necessary in order for us to be creative.
Yeah, I mean, I think that um, scarcity in education could be this degree of isolation, um, and I think that there's some truth to that, as we see a lot of innovative schools in isolation, but in reality, we should be having um, more innovation across the board um, because our students deserve it. But I think that there's a lot to be said about what you mentioned regarding Rousseau and the scarcity piece, but um, I think that we need to have more diffusion of the innovation and have structures in place to allow, uh, those new practices or practices that actually work. Percolate into schools. And I think that a lot of schools in the United States are beginning to do this, in the UK as well as in Australia, the instructional coaching movement, and really investing in instructional coaches and really doing it in a way that is pragmatic so that you're diffusing the information well within your organizations and schools, so that you're going to get initially the enthusiasts on board, but you're also going to get the mid majority, which is the greater bulk of your teachers completing those types of practices to support student learning. Ultimately, you may not never get the 10% of teachers that are stuck in their ways, but if you get that 90%, you're going to see a lot of growth in terms of your student outcomes as well as the growth of your staff.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I really meant was not necessarily that that's necessarily a positive thing, but I think in terms of learning, especially for our kids, if they have some sort of scarcity in terms of what they have available, let's say in the classroom, and they actually are forced to produce something creative that makes them play or whatever it is, I think that sometimes helps, because I at times I feel that we have almost an overload of stimuli around us. Even within classroom there is so many things, so many plays and games and whatever available for kids, that ultimately it says to them, or implies at least, that what, everything is already available for you, you don't really have to do anything. And I think that, as you mentioned, that is kind of risky in terms of the innovative piece that we want to forge right in our students, because I think innovation is certainly a word that gets thrown around a lot, and I think it's important.
Yeah, and no, understand what you're saying now. I really, I mean, the biggest thing for me when you mention that is just really this notion of gradual release, and I think um, within instruction, I think we really need to make sure our students have a foundational knowledge, so they have a degree of being a novice and moving more towards not being an expert, but really have foundational knowledge. But once they have that foundational knowledge in that domain, then we can really create additional structures or less structures for them to be innovative and creative. And I think where we're going with AI, as long as you have those foundational skills, you're getting so much knowledge now and the ability to utilize that knowledge to do creative things that we could have never dreamed of. So it's um, interesting kind of where we're going with that in terms of education. But I think that foundational knowledge is key. But once you have that foundational knowledge, you can then create those structures or create less of those structures for students to be creative and do things that are, um, novel and unique.
You mentioned AI. What is your take on AI and how can it actually improve co-teaching?
Yeah, so we mentioned in the book that essentially like your co-pilot, it's your thought partner. It's um, eh, you know, a thing that can really support your planning and support differentiating instruction and really personalizing opportunities for your students in your class. I mean, what took hours in the past can now take a matter of minutes or seconds. Um, and also being able to use AI in terms of um, the multimodality piece. So, for example, in classrooms now we have, whether you're using an iPad or Chromebook, for example, you can use an application, and there's several of these around. I call them digital mini whiteboards, but they have the AI embedded in them. So students are working on that mini whiteboard problem as that formative assessment. Both co-teachers can see what's going on that mini whiteboard, but the AI is in that whiteboard so that when students are answering that question or problem or etc., they're getting that personalized feedback as well as the co-teachers are seeing what's happening in the classroom. So then they can then, you know, drive their teaching. So they can see what problems students are getting right or wrong, um, and then really diverting their efforts to supporting students that need that extra support, as well as students that are may need that extension piece. And what the AI does too is it provides the students with their individualized and personalized feedback, so that that initial piece of feedback is already given, and then the co-teachers can then really um, provide that further their instruction that way because they'll know what's going on in the classroom.
Have you always been so positive towards AI in terms of teaching?
I would say that I'm more on the AI optimist train, but at the same time, I think that there's definitely drawbacks. I think we really need to focus on foundational skills before you really introduce AI, but also understanding that students need to have a degree of knowledge related to what AI is, how it works, how do the models work, the biases, hallucinations, um, kind of like the media literacy as well as digital literacy come together and data literacy. So I think that there's a lot that we need to teach our students now. I think much more content than we currently have offered in schools. So they really can understand this technology and utilize it in ways that are productive. Um, so, I mean, overall, I'm not really concerned about the whole cheating piece because I think you can design your learning experiences where um, you can avoid the cheating piece. But I think though the real danger is that we can't just let students use AI without having knowledge of what it does and what are its drawbacks. Um, and doing it in ways that are productive to society and not bad things. So it's really like any emerging technology, but it's something that we really need to deal with early on in a student's education so they have that foundational piece about it. So as they progress and as the technology progresses, they have an understanding of what it is and they grow with the innovations because it's moving so quickly. So it's definitely one of the things that we really need to evolve quickly with.
How do you address the cheating that comes potentially with AI? Let's say ELA, writing an essay. How would you address and go about an exam that you can ensure that students cannot cheat?
So there's one strategy that I really like to use is and you don't need AI detectors. AI detectors don't work. You could be on a Google document or Microsoft document that you assign via Canvas or whatever LMS that you're utilizing. Um, but you become the owner of the document as the teacher, and you look at the history of the document. Look at the history of the student interactions on the document. Look at where they're copying and pasting. Did they copy and paste the entirety of the document? as well as, or did they copy only bits and pieces of it? But also, I think with your students, as you're going through the writing process, you scaffold it in a way where you can do your brainstorm with the AI. You can come up with some ideas with AI, but for that final draft and that synthesis, you're writing it more by yourself. So you scaffold it so that you're using AI maybe for parts of it, but you're also not using it for the final piece. And also, when it comes to assessment, is that you're focusing on what the students know in that moment of time, so you don't have AI be a part of it. But maybe for a project based learning type scenario, you're going to have them use AI. So I really think that you you need to integrate the AI in bits and pieces of the writing process, but I think that when you're truly assessing their writings, maybe they need to write like a claim, and evidence and conclusion statement, a short response. You assess them that way in their writing, or you assess them in terms of adding evidence into a paragraph or doing citations correctly. Doing these smaller assessments, where you see what they know, and then for more of the longer project, you allow them to use AI in bits and pieces of it. So um, I think that we can't ignore it, but we can also assess students without it.
Do you think that pen and paper is still a viable choice for, let's say, ELA or history?
I think pen and paper is great for assessing foundational knowledge. I mean, I think that taking notes by paper is fantastic. I think writing rough drafts is great using pen and paper to jot down ideas. There's a lot of research coming out where the handwriting piece is it really helps you remember things. When we look at the science of learning, and we want to not totally get rid of that because we want things that help us learn, not things that don't help us learn. When we're on a screen all day, it's not going to help us learn as much as if we were actually taking notes with pen and paper. Um, writing some initial drafts or ideas with pen and paper. Um, to me, that's really important that we can never move away from completely. So it's an ebb and flow approach when you're using technology versus non-tech options. And I think that within our instruction, we need to provide it's an ebb and flow. It's never a balance. So I think that we just need to always keep that in mind of, are we incorporating strategies and ways in our classroom that are helping our students learn versus sometimes I think when we integrate technology, we're looking for the bells and whistles of things, but if we don't have the core of or the engine, then we're not going to get the outcomes that we want with the bells and whistles. So I think we go back to the basics, focus on how we learn, and then you can add technology strategically in a way that ebbs and flows.
I think this is so important what you're actually saying because, as you mentioned, really research really supports that writing with all, really writing is a process that you really involve all your senses, right? And therefore, it's also much more likely that the information actually sticks, right? And I think we really have to help also understand young people that handwriting in and of itself is an art, a way of expressing yourself. And I think that's also a skill that we should never lose. I think that's also something that it's important. How is your handwriting?
I've never been a good at handwriting things, but I do take notes. And whether that's doing it through a digital pen or writing things on a piece of paper, um, I still do that. Even though I'm very technology oriented, um, it helps me remember things. So I'm going to do things to help me remember things. So I'm not going to go away with it. But I also think, what I like to do, especially with people that I'm close to in my life, is handwrite letters, handwrite cards, because I think there's a more of a degree of authenticity to it than versus if you're typing something out to someone, right? I think it's because it means that you've taken the time to think about something and write something, and your handwriting is truly something unique to you. And I think that when you write a letter or something to someone, is that you really took the time to write that to them.
Yeah, it's so true. And it also shows to some extent your vulnerability, right? Because it's pretty, close, and it's something that it's really shows who you are. And it takes a certain amount of courage to actually be proud of it, or at least sharing it, through a letter, right?
Yeah, I mean, for example, like for a birthday coming up, my wife's birthday is coming up. I always write her a handwritten letter for her birthday, and it's something, and I create the card for her. I don't buy a card; I make it myself because I think when you invest in time in something, it's one of the best gifts that you can give someone, other than spending time with them. So
So true. And it's wonderful that I'm always proud when I hear that people still get married and commit. That's beautiful, and that's too. I guess you can attest that's a journey together. But I think at the very end, it's all worthwhile. When I talk to my 70, 80 years old friends, they always tell me the same thing. Yes, sometimes it was really, really tough, and yes, we struggle, but it was all worthwhile.
yeah, definitely.
History too, it also actually shows the process of the student thinking and learning, right? Because you can actually tell if he erased a word or not. And so I think it's also a good indicator for a teacher to actually see where the students is at.
Agree. When you're looking at drafts of things, you can see kind of that process over time. And I think that we really need to focus on the process of how things are created, whether it's a piece of writing or, a multimedia or movie or music. I think if we focus on the process piece of it and show students how to create the process and those foundational skills required to do that, then they're going to be fine in the world with AI because they'll have the foundational skills of how to do something. And I think that really content knowledge is so critical in the time that we live in. And I think being able to evaluate multiple steps of something requires that content knowledge. You can't look at a entirety of a car engine if you don't know how all the parts interact, right? Or how an airplane flies, or how a large language model functions. I think that we have to understand the processes of how these things work and how things are created. And I think that that's what we need to do as teachers in our classrooms do for something like writing, as simple as that, or how to solve a particular math problem. What are the steps, or how did you solve X, Y, and Z of this equation? So it's something that we really need to focus on.
You mentioned also the process, how important it is in a partnership, especially co teaching, right? And one word that you mention over and over again is trust. How do you build trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like any relationship. I mean, when you go through highs and lows in a classroom, especially throughout a school year, you're going to either build trust or you're not. And that means that if you don't build that trust, then you're probably not going to be teaching together the next year. Um, but the trust piece comes in when, relying on someone to do something. Maybe when it comes to planning, or when it comes to communicating with the family, or making sure that you're providing all the assessment data for an upcoming individualized educational plan meeting, or ensuring that you're going to follow through on our agreement for how we're going to navigate classroom management and discipline. I mean, all those actions add up, and it's like any relationship. You have to have that degree of trust in order for you to move forward together. And if that trust is violated by one of the parties, you need to figure out a way where you're going to come back together and trust each other again. And there's a lot of things that happen. Mistakes are obviously made. It's never a perfect situation, but I think though, if you can look at every little action as a part of that bond of trust that you're working together, while it might never be, you're going to make mistakes, but if you know that that person's pretty reliable, and um, ultimately over time, as you go through that first year with them, you're going to build that degree of trust, and especially when you have a hard day, when when students are, it could be a crazy day, and both of you are extremely tired, and maybe the lesson didn't go the way that it went, and the student went running out of the classroom. You're able to be vulnerable together and talk about it and try and make things better. I think that's really an important facet of this.
And really, therefore, the stages are also important because it gives you somehow a roadmap what you will actually go through. So lay out the three stages of really supportive, the team stage, and then really the advanced stage.
Really, the basics are, one teach, one support, one teach, one observe. Really, that's where one teacher is predominantly doing more of the teaching, while the other teacher is more in that support role. And we really want to get out of that particular place where we want to be teaching together through like team teaching, station teaching, parallel teaching, where we want to be doing the active teaching together, or you're separately doing it to support a group of students. So that's really where we want, really, starting beginning co-teachers to get to by mid-year. We want them to get to where they're comfortable with team teaching, where they're comfortable with parallel teaching, where they're comfortable with doing some station teaching. And then when you get to more of those advanced stages like role playing or alternative teaching, you're able to really have, I think it's from experience, a degree of synergy, where you're able to plan these things out and you're very strategic with it. But you're also able to go back to, each of the stages of co-teaching because your lesson's dynamic. It's going to ebb and flow and change, and you're able to, adjust on the fly, but also plan for these things too. So, um, that's the way that the stages go. Um, it's it's a linear process to start, but at one point or another, it doesn't become, it's not a straight line anymore. It becomes more of where you can go back and forth between the various stages and strategies within those stages.
It's really life, right? It's like what's important is really the trajectory. And if the trajectory points towards the positive, I think that's already a big success. So now I invite everyone who is listening now to go on solutiontree.com and buy order a copy of Co-Teaching Evolved by Dr. Matthew Rhoads and Dr. Belinda Karg to really get your co-teaching to a whole other level. What if I incorporate all what you have written in this powerful book? How does it change my teaching and, most importantly, the learning of my students?
I think ultimately it creates a degree of, I'm just going to continue going back to this word, it's dynamic. It creates a dynamic teaching environment where your students are going to get more attention, and you're going to have two adults in the classroom that are working together to support them in their learning. And I think having background in this is really important because I think every teacher should co-teach for some years in their career. I think it's one of the best forms of teaching. It's one of the best forms of professional development and growth. And it also gives you perspectives of watching someone every day that could be a great teacher in the class. I mean, what's better than that? And supporting students at the same time. So I think, taking a look at this book and hopefully, trying it out, whether you're a school leader or teacher, in your context is a great way to really expand your toolkit.
What do you do when you are not in school? What do you do in your free time to rejuvenate?
I love working out. I love going to the beach. I like trying new restaurants out and food. And I just really enjoy writing and learning new things. I mean, it's just always something new to learn, and it's the beauty of education. You're always reading something new. You're always trying to do something new, and trying to get better every day. So
What makes you truly feel alive?
I think just having a purpose and being able to. know that I'm trying to make an impact where I'm currently at locally, and also trying to make an impact outside my community, regionally and globally.
Dr. Matthew Rhoads, thank you so much for being a blessing to myself and really to the world, and being and taking the time for on being here on the show.
Yeah, I appreciate your time, and I look forward to listening to this episode as well as others on the Why Knowledge Matters podcast.
Dr. Matthew Rhoads. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.the-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.